So during this period of time, and I want to give him all the accolades that I have gathered, he found us in 1974. He's been a licensed Unity teacher since 1996, but in 94 and 95, he served 2 terms as board president. Was anybody here besides me on the board with David? Ann and 2 Anns, okay. They were some of the longest board meetings, but we accomplished a lot. He's been on 2 nominating committees and 2 ministerial search committees. He is well known as our Bible scholar, and he teaches an amazing class on metaphysics every year during C Week. So our very own, our very special, welcome David Drumm.
Thank you, Ann, for the kind introduction, and good morning, everyone. When I was asked to speak this morning, I had to go into a process of discernment about the topic. What was it that was wanting to be heard in this time and place? And my answer came to me when I was noticing some email traffic among various Unity groups revisiting the identity of Unity as a movement and framing the question as, is Unity Christian or is Unity universal spirituality? That's the way the question's framed in several of these forums that are going on, and people are voting on that, between that dichotomy. And I thought I wanted to contribute to that conversation, and so my topic is Unity Christian? And after I had made that decision, I was having lunch with a friend of mine who is a Reformed Jew, and he asked me, what's new? And I said, well, what's new is I'm working on a sermon on the topic, is Unity, my denomination, Christian? And his response was, well, that's interesting that that's even a question, because my understanding of being a Christian is you believe in original sin, and you believe that the antidote to original sin is the death and resurrection of Jesus. And I said, you're not the only one that defines Christianity that way. What I'm going to talk about is a different way of looking at Christianity. And we went on and talked about it for the whole lunch for 50 minutes. I kept saying, do you want me to stop? And he said, no, this is fascinating. Tell me more. But I'll end my recounting of that conversation here. And then the next thing that brought to mind is I've always been a fan of the Alice in Wonderland books, Lewis Carroll. There's a lot of germs of wisdom in those books. And I was reminded of the encounter that Alice had in Through the Looking Glass with Humpty Dumpty, the Eggman. And Humpty Dumpty makes the assertion to Alice. He says, when I use a word, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. Now that's an interesting thing to think about, because if we all used words in that way, it would be kind of difficult to communicate. The process of communication depends upon some shared understanding of the meaning of words. And so if a word means just what the speaker intends, and that's it, you can't have much of a conversation. And so since we're having a conversation as a denominational community about the question, is Unity Christian, I wanted to give some perspective on a common understanding of what it means to be a Christian and what Christianity is. And I would start from the standpoint that I would say Christianity is a religious tradition. And I would distinguish between a religious tradition and a religion. Why? A religion is defined by a doctrine, a particular set of beliefs and values, but a tradition endures over time. The Christian tradition is over 2,000 years old. And one thing about traditions is the ones that survive are not the ones that never change. the environment changes, and unless a tradition changes in response to its environment, it won't endure. And so what has caused the Christian tradition to endure is exactly that it has not been the same throughout its history. And one of the authors that I admire is a German Catholic theologian named Hans Kung, who's written a book on Christianity. I'm going to draw from his ideas today in my talk. And Kung maps out five different historical paradigms of Christianity to date, with a sixth emerging. And I'm going to lightly touch on those to illustrate how the tradition has changed. But for the starting point, we need to go back to Jesus of Nazareth, which is the fountain of the tradition. The tradition comes from the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, and you might suppose that we've known the authentic teachings of Jesus in an unbroken line from the first century up to today, that it's just been, as some like to say, a deposit of faith. You know, John Shelby Spong says, that sounds like pigeon droppings, deposit of faith, you know. It hasn't been that. It's been a continued dialogue, and it's really only in the last couple of hundred years that scholars have had the freedom to inquire beyond the letter, the four corners of the biblical text, into a critical study of what do we really learn from these texts when critically examined about who Jesus was and what he taught. And my source on this subject is an author named Robert Funk, who's one of the fellows of the Jesus Seminar, who has engaged in the most recent round of this work of discovering the historical Jesus. And being exposed to the Jesus Seminar writings has strengthened my passion for these teachings, because they're much more meaningful to me as coming to me this way than from an uncritical reading of the biblical text. And so I'm going to try to present a very brief, in the time allowed, summary of what I understand the historical Jesus taught. First of all, the central idea of the teaching is the idea of the kingdom of heaven. But you might be surprised to find that Jesus never speaks of the kingdom of heaven as a destination for the afterlife. In fact, when Jesus speaks of the kingdom of heaven, he says, it is here spread out before you, but you don't see it. So Jesus clearly defined the kingdom of heaven as a present reality of perfection that is right here with us, but we don't see it. We don't acknowledge it, we don't see it. And he illustrated that through metaphors embodying everyday concepts like the mustard seed. Mustard seed starts small, but eventually grows into a tree with a big trunk. The leaven in the bread can take a little bit of flour and make it into a bread that is much, much bigger. And the kingdom of heaven, when perceived by the imagination, has the effect of bringing what is perceived in imagination into being. And so if you perceive the possibility of perfection, then you participate in the process of perfecting the world. And so if you look at things this way, there's no room for the distinctions that Jesus found in his religion of origin, the Jewish tradition, between sacred time and profane time, between sacred space and profane space. Everything is sacred in the kingdom of heaven if you perceive it to be sacred. And so that's why Jesus healed on the Sabbath, which was set aside as a holy day. You weren't supposed to do mundane work on the Sabbath. That's why he overturned the tables in the temple, because the temple is only as sacred as people's behavior makes it in the temple. And very importantly, Jesus didn't make a distinction between insiders and outsiders, those that have the ability to see the kingdom and those that don't have the ability to see the kingdom. And so there was no, these are the Christians. They didn't even call themselves Christians then, but there was no distinction. These are the Christians, these are the infidels. Everyone was a human soul with the capacity to see the kingdom. And Jesus lived this out by keeping an open table. I love the words of Funk. He says, Jesus shared his table promiscuously. He would break bread with anyone, including the most despised classes of the day. Those were lepers, tax collectors. People hated the tax collectors because they came and took away all their produce. Prostitutes, Samaritans. It's hard for us to appreciate this, but the Jews were sworn enemies of the Samaritan because they had alternative temples. The Jews had their temple in Jerusalem. The Samaritans had their temple in the north of Israel, in Samaria, and it was like the Protestants and Catholics in Northern Ireland. It was a bitter fight over who was right. But Jesus engaged with Samaritans just the same way he engaged with Jews, illustrating that he didn't believe in separation. Some other parables of Jesus about the kingdom involve finding what is lost. The lost pearl, the lost sheep, there's several of those. And that again illustrates this concept that the kingdom of heaven is there, but it's lost. But we have the ability to find it by perceiving it. And when we find it, the only natural reaction is joy and celebration. So there's a theme. The Christianity I grew up with, I didn't think you Christians really were supposed to celebrate. You know, you were supposed to kind of sit still in your pew and behave yourself. But I think Jesus really taught that we should celebrate because it is really a joyful thing to find what is lost. And he also taught that you don't want to wear your religion on your sleeve. You know, I think this will be interesting to some people that are out there calling themselves Christians, that the last thing Jesus taught was a holier-than-thou attitude, that, in fact, he said, if you're going to pray, close the door, don't let anybody see you. If you're going to give, don't let the right hand know what the left hand is doing. You don't give so you can get your name at the top of the plaque. You know, give because it feels good to give. And praying in private, he had a relationship with the source of being, which he identified with the God of the Jewish scriptures, but he referred to it in very familiar terms as Abba, or Daddy, the equivalent of Daddy. And so Jesus taught an unbrokered relationship with God, meaning that we don't need any intermediaries. And this will be interesting when we go through the history, you know, how we've tended to create intermediaries, brokers between ourselves and God. But Jesus said, you don't need a broker. Just go into the silence and you'll have the experience of God. Jesus taught that if you identify what you really need, I'm reminded of the Rolling Stones song here, you may not get what you want, but sometimes you get what you need. If you identify what you really need and ask for it, then the universe is constructed in such a way that you will get it, that it will flow into you. Also that rewards and punishment are intrinsic to what we do. They're not external. We don't get rewarded or punished by a scorekeeper God that's out there keeping a checklist and saying this person should be rewarded because they're doing good things, this thing should be punished because we do good things. We're rewarded or punished because doing the right thing is its own reward. Doing the wrong thing brings its own consequences. So a little bit different maybe than some of us grew up in learning about Christianity. So what happened? Well, what happened is there was added to the religion of Jesus that I've just done my best to summarize in about 10 minutes. the religion about Jesus. And there's nothing wrong with the religion about Jesus, because we need to relate our understanding of the historical Jesus to the current time and place. So in a way, a religion about Jesus is necessary, but we have to take it with a grain of salt, because that religion about Jesus may change as the circumstances and the culture change. And let me demonstrate, going back to Kuhn's paradigms. Christianity rose in a paradigm that Kuhn calls the Jewish apocalyptic. And this original Christians did not consider themselves to be a separate religion. They considered themselves to be a teaching within Judaism. And you get a flavor of this worldview, the first paradigm of Christianity, particularly in reading the Gospels of Matthew and the Gospels of Mark. In the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus is presented as Moses 2.0, the next and greatest lawgiver in the tradition of Moses. There's all kinds of clues of that in Matthew I don't have to go into, but it's in answering the question, who Jesus is, what is the religion about Jesus, they said, well, he's the next lawgiver, the next prophet of the Jewish tradition. Mark saw him out of the apocalyptic part of the Jewish tradition. The word apocalyptic means revealed, and it usually was a revelation about the ending of the current age and the coming of the new age, the next age. And in Mark, you get a flavor that the current age is controlled by demons, is demonic, but that Jesus' role is to bring in the new age by exorcising the demons and by ushering in a new age. That's all part of the first paradigm of Christianity. But Christianity only became a world religion in the concept of the second paradigm, which was a Greek Hellenistic paradigm. And in this paradigm, Christianity identified itself in the terms spoken by the Greek philosophers, such as Plato and Aristotle. And it's from the Greek conception of Christianity that we get our idea of an eternal soul that leaves the prison of the body and floats up to heaven. It's also where we get our idea of a process of a human being coming to perfection. One of the teachings in the Greek Orthodox Church is that God became man so that man may become God. So there's a lot of teaching about perfecting and becoming divine in the Greek paradigm. But the Greek paradigm was succeeded by the Latin, Roman, legalistic paradigm. And in this paradigm, for the first time, the philosopher Augustine introduced the idea of original sin, that we may think, well, this is just foundational to Christianity. Christianity was a tradition for about 500 years, or 400 years at least, before the idea of original sin was formulated. The idea of original sin gave a basis for a church hierarchy where the sacraments administered by the consecrated priest of the church would remove the stain of the original sin. So the Catholic paradigm is the escape from original sin is you go take the communion. It has to be delivered by a priest who's got the right kind of consecration, and you do the baptism and the other rites. And that is a version that my Jewish friend could finally recognize, after 400 years. Okay, now you're getting into Christianity, because now you're talking about original sin. And the Catholic Roman paradigm was the leading paradigm for about 1,000 years. And then around 1500, John Calvin and Martin Luther, well, I told them in the wrong order, Martin Luther and then John Calvin, came in and instigated the Protestant Reformation. And what that did was shift. It kept the concept of original sin, but it shifted the antidote from it's no longer the sacraments administered by the priest. It's a personal experience of grace. And in the original teaching of the Protestant denominations, there was a predetermination of who grace was offered to, the saved, and who grace was not offered to, the damned. And an individual person could not do anything about that, but you could have an interior experience of grace and say, oh yeah, I feel like I'm probably one of the ones elected to salvation. You know, isn't that great? But you're still in the paradigm of original sin and needing the antidote. So the fifth paradigm was the modern scientific paradigm, which was ushered in by people like Galileo, Newton, Kepler, when scientific discoveries were made that called into doubt whether you could understand the biblical narrative in literal, concrete terms, because the cosmology that the authors of the Bible were operating in was not the cosmology of Galileo or Newton. It just didn't fit. And so what are you going to do about that? What does that do for your belief? Well, there were two directions to go. The fundamentalists went the direction of rejecting at least some of the scientific paradigm and saying, if science is inconsistent with the Bible, that just means we can't believe science. But others incorporated the scientific teachings into their understanding of the Bible, and those are what we call the mainline Protestant sects today. So the fundamentalists like to think they go back to the original first century Christianity. Fundamentalism arose as a reaction to the scientific discoveries of the Enlightenment. But fundamentalism is only at most about 300 years old, maybe not even that old. So where are we now? The modern paradigm is now being challenged by concepts of relativism, perspectivism, constructivism, the ideas that we create our own reality from our perspective, and nobody's viewpoint is privileged, all truth is relative. That's a postmodern paradigm, and the Christian tradition must reform itself in response to this paradigm shift, as it has reformed itself in response to the previous paradigm shifts. And I see that Unity and the other New Thought denominations are uniquely poised to be in the vanguard of defining the sixth paradigm, Christianity. And I, for one, am not willing to cede the definition of Christianity or being a Christian to the Humpty Dumptys of the world who would say it means what they say it means. I think it means the full panoply of the tradition and how we can fit into the tradition today. And so I would submit that the question being posed in the current dialogue, vote, is unity Christian, is university spirituality, is a false dichotomy, because I would submit the view of Christianity I've just presented, which is based on history, I think, I didn't make it up, is universalistic. I think the original teachings of Jesus are universalistic. I think the word Catholic actually means universal. We may not think of it in those terms, but the Catholic Church was trying in the best way it could to be universal. And I think, and the Protestants tried to make it even more universal by saying it doesn't depend on a hierarchy of priests and bishops. It's everybody in conscience. We've been trying to do our best to live up to the teachings of Jesus. And I don't think we should abandon the effort just because some people want to define Christianity as the belief in original sin and the escape from original sin, either through the sacraments or through some kind of election of grace by faith. I think that would be cutting off our roots, cutting off our feet. And one thing I've learned from some of the studies I've done is that what is repressed returns, often in an ugly way. This is true in our personal stories, our personal shadows. It's also true in our cultural collective history. And that goes back to the shared ideas that refute Humpty's principle, that we can have a dialogue because we share meaning between ourselves. And if we don't understand the story of how these shared meanings came into being, then I think the equivalent of cultural shadows to our personal shadows come in. And so I would encourage us to embrace our Christian tradition. The current branding of unity defines unity as a positive, practical, progressive approach to Christianity, the 3 Ps. That's under review. Maybe that's not the perfect way to say it. But I would submit that there's nothing non-universal inherent in Christianity except when we don't live up to it and don't make it as universal as we can be. I know in my teachings I incorporate the Tao Te Ching, the Upanishads, the Kabbalah, all kinds of teachings that can be built upon it. And Hans Kung actually agrees with me as a Catholic priest. Hans Kung says there's nothing inherently non-ecumenical about Christianity. There's no reason that Christianity can't incorporate Zen Buddhism, Hindu chakras, whatever, because it is intended to be a universal teaching about human potential. But that's just my perspective, and we are in an a-perspectival world, so I invite all of you to do your own reflection on this question. And I would hope that we could have some kind of session here at Unity of Dallas where we could come together and dialogue and share our perspectives, because this format only lends to me talking at you, and I'd like to hear what you think also. So that will be my wish, that we can have some continued conversations about this as a community and figure out what our shared meaning of Christianity is. So thank you for your attention. And you want me to do meditation? Do a meditation?
Sure.
Okay.
Yeah, we got time for meditation.
Well, if we don't, it's fine, but I was told. Okay, all right. Trying to be a good boy. All right. So let's take these thoughts into a brief meditative space and create that space by dissolving the concepts and ideas that have been floating through our minds into the residue of feelings that underlie them, that come from our gut. And then let's allow those feelings to dissolve into the silence, the realm of pure possibility that the feelings arise from. And let's enter that space that the Zen Buddhists refer to as beginner's mind, where we have no allegiances to pre-established concepts, but we are open and receptive to the living spirit of truth. And let's rest in that space for a moment of silence as to what and how we relate to the original ministry of Jesus of Nazareth and what our perspective on a religion about Jesus is. And so it is. Amen.